Young girl's marriage to an 80-year-old millionaire uncovers a shocking secret. The room was dim, the soft glow of candlelight flickering against the aged oak walls of the grand estate. Abigail, a wide-eyed 21-year-old, sat nervously at the edge of her seat, her hands trembling slightly against the delicate lace of her wedding dress. Outside, a cool autumn breeze carried the faint rustle of golden leaves, but inside, silence dominated, broken only by the ticking of an ornate grandfather clock. She had never imagined herself here, not in this life, not as the new bride of Henry Whittaker, the 80-year-old millionaire whose name carried as much weight in the business world as the heavy chandeliers above their heads. The ceremony had been quick, almost transactional. Her friends' voices still echoed in her mind, their protests sharp and cutting. "Abby, are you sure? Do you even know him?" She had shrugged off their concerns, desperate to escape the life she had known, a life of endless debt and shattered dreams. But now, as the clock struck another hour, reality closed in. Henry sat across from her, a man of sharp intellect and piercing blue eyes. His age was apparent but overshadowed by his commanding presence. He smiled at her, a gesture both warm and unsettling. "Abigail," he began, his voice gravelly yet firm, "welcome to your new life. There are things you'll need to know, in time." A chill ran down her spine. What could he mean? What had she signed up for? And why did she feel as though she had just stepped into a trap despite the glittering jewels and the promise of comfort? Abigail's life had always been a precarious balancing act, teetering between survival and despair. Growing up in the shadow of her family's financial ruin, she had learned early on that dreams often come with a hefty price tag. Her mother's illness had drained what little savings they had, and her father's failed business ventures left them buried in debt. By the time she was 18, Abigail juggled multiple jobs, waitressing at a diner by day and cleaning office buildings at night, barely scraping together enough to keep the lights on in their dilapidated apartment. Despite her hardships, Abigail had always been resilient. She was the kind of person who could turn a thrift store dress into a red carpet gown with a little creativity. But no amount of ingenuity could fix the insurmountable pile of bills that continued to grow. When Henry Whittaker's proposal came, it wasn't a romantic whirlwind, it was a lifeline. Henry had entered her life like a storm, unexpected and impossible to ignore. The millionaire's reputation preceded him, a shrewd businessman who had built an empire from nothing. His name was synonymous with power and influence, but also with mystery. Rumors swirled about his past, each more outlandish than the last, but none could be confirmed. When he approached Abigail with his unusual proposition, it was as though he had plucked her out of obscurity and thrust her into a world she never imagined. At first, she couldn't understand why he had chosen her. She was young, inexperienced, and far removed from the glamorous circles he frequented. But Henry had made his intentions clear: "I need a companion. Someone I can trust. In return, you'll have everything you could ever need." The offer was impossible to refuse. Her family's debts would vanish overnight, her mother's medical care secured, and she'd never have to wonder where her next meal would come from. Yet, as she signed the papers that bound her to this enigmatic man, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into uncharted waters. Her new life promised security, but it also came with unspoken rules, veiled secrets, and a sense of foreboding that lingered like a shadow. The first night in Henry Whittaker's sprawling estate felt like stepping into a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. Abigail's gaze flitted over the opulence that surrounded her, marble floors that gleamed under the warm glow of chandeliers, oil paintings that seemed to watch her as she moved, and antique furniture that looked as though it belonged in a museum. It was a far cry from the peeling wallpaper and second-hand couches of her childhood home. Yet, for all its grandeur, the estate felt cold, as if the walls themselves held secrets they refused to share. Dinner that evening was a formal affair. Henry had insisted on it, explaining that it was important to set the tone for their new life together. Abigail had never been more aware of the weight of expectation. Seated at the far end of a long dining table, she felt miles away from the man she had just married. "Henry, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, watched her with a calm intensity that unsettled her. The staff moved in silence, their presence a mere whisper in the background as they served an elaborate meal she barely touched. "Abigail," Henry's voice broke the stillness, firm yet measured. "You'll need to become accustomed to this lifestyle. There will be dinners, parties, and," he paused, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers, "expectations." She swallowed hard, nodding even though she wasn't sure what he meant. Expectations. The word echoed in her mind, heavy with implication. As the meal drew to a close, Henry gestured for her to join him in his study. The room was lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, filled with leather-bound volumes that exuded an air of authority. A roaring fire cast flickering shadows across the dark wood paneling. Henry poured 2 glasses of brandy, handing one to Abigail before settling into an armchair opposite her. "There are matters we must discuss," he began, his tone low and deliberate. "You may have entered this arrangement for your reasons, but there are responsibilities that come with being Mrs. Whittaker." Abigail's grip tightened on the glass. "Responsibilities?" He leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "This house, my wealth, my reputation, they are all tied to my name. And now, they are tied to yours. There will be questions. People will pry. I expect discretion and loyalty." The firelight danced in his eyes, giving him an almost otherworldly aura. "But there is more," he continued, his voice dipping lower. "There are things about this house, this life, that you may find unsettling. You must follow my lead and trust me implicitly." Abigail's breath caught. The room seemed to grow colder despite the fire. "What things?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "In time, my dear. All in time." As she left the study that night, Abigail's mind swirled with unease. This was more than she had bargained for. She had married Henry for security, but now it felt as though she had stepped into a game where she didn't know the rules, or the stakes. And for the first time, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Abigail woke the next morning to the sound of soft footsteps retreating from her bedroom door. She sat up, her heart racing, and found a silver tray placed on the small table near the window. It held a steaming pot of tea, fresh croissants, and a single red rose. The gesture should have been romantic, but instead, it felt calculated, almost like a peace offering. She glanced at the door, wondering who had delivered it and why they hadn't knocked. The estate, sprawling and labyrinthine, seemed larger in the daylight. Abigail decided to explore, hoping to familiarize herself with her new home. The grand hallways were lined with portraits of Whittakers from generations past, their eyes seeming to follow her every move. She paused in front of a particularly striking painting, a young woman with dark hair and piercing eyes, her expression caught somewhere between sorrow and defiance. There was no plaque or nameplate beneath it, and when Abigail later asked one of the housemaids about it, the woman stiffened and quickly changed the subject. By the end of her second week, Abigail began to understand that the grandeur of the estate was a carefully maintained illusion. The staff, though polite, operated under a tense, unspoken set of rules. Rooms were cleaned meticulously but never lingered in. Doors were closed as quickly as they were opened, and certain parts of the house were off-limits altogether. One day, while wandering through the West Wing, a section of the estate Henry had warned her not to enter, Abigail stumbled upon a locked door. Its brass handle was tarnished, and the wood around it seemed older than the rest of the house. She ran her fingers over the door, her curiosity piqued, but before she could investigate further, a voice startled her. "That's not a place you should be, Mrs. Whittaker." She turned to find Mr. Grayson, the estate's butler, standing behind her. His usually impassive face betrayed a flicker of unease. "Forgive me," she said quickly, stepping away from the door. "I didn't realize." Mr. Grayson inclined his head. "Some doors are best left unopened." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Abigail more curious than ever. That night, At dinner, Henry's demeanor was unusually reserved. Abigail decided to probe, hoping to unravel some of the mystery surrounding the house. "Henry, who is the woman in the portrait in the east hallway?" she asked casually, slicing into her fillet. Henry's knife paused mid-cut, and his eyes flicked to hers, sharp and guarded. "A relative," he said curtly. "She's been gone for a long time." "Gone?" Abigail pressed, her curiosity outweighing her caution. Henry set his utensils down with deliberate care. "Abigail, I've told you before. There are parts of this house, and my life, that you do not need to concern yourself with." His tone left no room for argument, and the rest of the meal passed in uncomfortable silence. Later that night, as Abigail lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that Henry's secrets were not just his own, they were now hers to bear, whether she liked it or not. The following days brought more questions than answers. Abigail overheard snippets of conversations among the staff, whispers that stopped abruptly whenever she entered the room. She caught fragments. "She doesn't know yet, he'll tell her when he's ready," and once, chillingly, "Do you think she'll stay?" The unease grew into a gnawing sense of paranoia. Abigail began to feel as though she were being watched, even when she was alone. One afternoon, while reading in the library, she noticed a shadow pass under the door. When she opened it, the hallway was empty. Her breaking point came one stormy evening when she found the door to the west wing slightly ajar. The flickering light of a nearby sconce illuminated the narrow gap, and Abigail's curiosity overpowered her fear. She slipped inside, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The corridor beyond was colder, darker. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and something metallic. At the end of the hall was another door, this one unlocked. Abigail hesitated, her hand hovering over the handle, before pushing it open. The room was small and cluttered, filled with stacks of old documents, ledgers, and faded photographs. In the center of the room stood a large oak desk, its surface covered in yellowed papers and an ornate key. Abigail's heart raced as she sifted through the documents. Most were incomprehensible, legal jargon and business contracts, but one letter caught her eye. It was addressed to Henry and written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. "You cannot keep hiding this. The truth will come out, and when it does, it will destroy everything." Before she could read further, a floorboard creaked behind her. Abigail spun around to see Henry standing in the doorway, his face a mask of controlled fury. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Abigail held up the letter, her hand trembling. "What is this, Henry? What truth?" Henry stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "I warned you to stay out of this wing," he said, his tone icy. "There are things you are not ready to understand." "Then make me understand." Abigail's voice cracked with desperation. "You brought me into your life, into this house, but you keep me in the dark. How can I trust you when I don't even know what I'm trusting?" For a moment, Henry said nothing. The fire in his eyes dimmed, replaced by something that almost looked like regret. "Abigail," he began slowly, "there are complications in my life, things that I have spent years trying to manage. If you knew the full extent of it, you might wish you had never married me." She stepped closer, her fear giving way to resolve. "Try me." Henry sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. "Not here. Not like this. But I promise you, in time, you will know everything." It wasn't the answer Abigail wanted, but it was enough to keep her from walking away. For now. In the weeks that followed, Henry began to let Abigail into his world, albeit in carefully measured doses. He shared fragments of his past, stories of his rise to power, and the sacrifices it required. But there were still gaps, pieces of the puzzle that didn't fit. Abigail couldn't shake the feeling that Henry was keeping her close not out of love, but out of necessity. One night, as they sat by the fire, Abigail finally asked the question that had been weighing on her heart. "Henry, why did you choose me?" He looked at her, his expression unreadable. Because I saw something in you, he said after a long pause. Something rare. You're stronger than you realize, Abigail. And I need that strength more than you know. His words left her both comforted and unnerved. What did he mean by need? And why did it feel as though their marriage was more a shield for him than a partnership? As the days turned to weeks, Abigail's resolve hardened. If Henry wouldn't give her the answers she needed, she would find them herself. The house was filled with secrets, and she was determined to uncover every last one of them, no matter the cost. The storm raged outside the Whitaker estate, lightning illuminating the corridors in stark, fleeting bursts. Abigail's footsteps echoed through the halls as she clutched the ornate key she had discovered in the west wing. She wasn't sure what drove her forward, curiosity, defiance, or the desperate need to understand the man she had married. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the locked door at the end of the west wing corridor, its brass handle glinting in the dim light. The key slid into the lock with a satisfying click. Abigail hesitated, her breath catching in her throat, before pushing the door open. The room beyond was nothing like the rest of the estate. It was stark, almost clinical, with a metal desk, filing cabinets, and rows of shelves stacked with meticulously labeled boxes. On the desk sat a stack of papers and a ledger, but what caught Abigail's attention was a photograph framed in simple silver. It was the woman from the portrait in the east hallway, standing beside a younger Henry, their smiles frozen in time. She picked up the photo, her fingers trembling. Scribbled on the back in faint, hurried handwriting were the words, Charlotte Whitaker, 1962 to 1984. You weren't supposed to find this. The voice behind her sent a jolt through her body. She spun around to see Henry standing in the doorway, his face shadowed but his expression unmistakably grave. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. Abigail, I warned you about prying into things you don't understand. Then make me understand, she shot back, holding up the photograph. Who was Charlotte? And why is there a room in your house dedicated to secrets you won't share with me? Henry's shoulders sagged, the weight of years seeming to press down on him all at once. He gestured for her to sit, but she refused, her defiance holding firm. Charlotte was my wife, he began, his voice quieter now, tinged with something she hadn't heard before, vulnerability. She died, and I was responsible. Abigail's breath caught. What do you mean? Not directly, Henry clarified, running a hand through his silver hair. But my ambitions, my relentless drive for success, they consumed me. They consumed her. Charlotte wanted a simpler life, but I ignored her pleas. She turned to people I didn't trust and made enemies with people who wanted to hurt me. When she died in that car crash, I knew it wasn't an accident. Abigail's mind raced as she pieced together his words. You think someone killed her? Henry nodded, his eyes haunted. I've spent decades trying to protect what's mine, trying to ensure that no one else I care about is put in danger. That's why I keep secrets, Abigail. That's why I needed someone like you, someone who could navigate this life, who could be strong when I couldn't. Abigail's hands clenched into fists. You married me because you thought I could handle your mess. No, Henry said firmly, stepping closer. I married you because I saw someone who could stand beside me, not behind me. Someone who deserved the security I could offer, but who could also challenge me to be better. I didn't expect to care for you the way I do, but I'm not sorry it happened. The room fell silent except for the muffled roar of the storm outside. Abigail stared at him, her emotions a tumultuous mix of anger, fear, and something else she couldn't quite name. Henry, she began, her voice trembling, you can't keep running from your past. If we're going to make this work, you need to let me in. All the way. Henry's jaw tightened, but after a moment, he nodded. Then let me show you everything, he said. No more secrets. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time since stepping into the estate, Abigail felt a flicker of hope. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew she couldn't turn back now. The storm passed by morning, leaving the Whitaker estate shrouded in a heavy mist. Abigail woke with a sense of resolve she hadn't felt before. The night's revelations lingered in her mind: Charlotte, Henry's guilt, the enemies he had spent decades guarding against. For the first time, she felt as though she had glimpsed the man beneath the polished exterior, a man burdened by regrets and driven by fear. Henry kept his promise. Over the following days, he began to share the truths he had long kept hidden. Abigail learned about the deals made in dark corners, the rivals who had been waiting for a moment of weakness, and the lengths to which Henry had gone to protect his empire. Some stories chilled her, others softened her perception of him. She saw the complexities of a man who had sacrificed love and peace in pursuit of power, only to find himself alone and haunted by the cost. "I don't want you to bear these burdens," Henry admitted one evening as they sat in the study, the fire casting warm light over their faces. "But I know that asking you to trust me without showing you the full picture was unfair. I see that now." Abigail's lips pressed into a thin line. "Trust goes both ways, Henry. If you want this marriage to be real, you have to let me stand beside you, not behind you. I can't be a name partner only." Henry nodded, his gaze steady. "You're right. I see that now. And I'll do better." Their conversations marked the beginning of a new dynamic. Abigail was no longer content to sit on the sidelines, and Henry began to include her in decisions, both personal and professional. He introduced her to trusted advisors and brought her into meetings where she quickly proved her sharp instincts and resourcefulness. Though it was overwhelming at first, Abigail adapted, finding strength she hadn't realized she possessed. In time, she also began to address the tension within the estate. The staff, who had once spoken in hushed tones and avoided her gaze, began to warm to her. Abigail's kindness and willingness to understand their concerns broke down barriers, and soon the house that had felt so cold began to feel more alive. One evening, Abigail gathered the courage to revisit the West Wing. This time, she didn't sneak. She walked purposefully, the key in hand. Henry joined her, his presence a quiet reassurance. Together, they opened the door to the small room that had once held his secrets. This time, there was no anger, no fear, only a shared commitment to facing the past together. "What will you do with it all?" Abigail asked, gesturing to the files and photographs. Henry exhaled deeply. "Some of it needs to be destroyed. Some needs to be addressed. And some," he paused, meeting her eyes. "Some of it I need to atone for." Abigail reached for his hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Then we'll do it together." As the months passed, the changes in their relationship became evident to those around them. Henry's guarded demeanor softened, and Abigail's confidence grew. Together, they navigated the complexities of his business dealings, dismantling the more ruthless aspects of his empire while building a legacy rooted in integrity. It was not an easy process, and there were setbacks, but they faced them together. The estate, once a symbol of isolation and secrets, transformed into a place of renewal. Abigail began hosting dinners and events, inviting both Henry's business associates and local community leaders. She introduced initiatives to support the town, funding scholarships and local projects, determined to use the Whitaker name for good. One evening, as they strolled through the garden, Abigail turned to Henry with a soft smile. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Marrying me, bringing me into all of this?" Henry stopped walking, taking both of her hands in his. "Abigail, marrying you was the best decision I've ever made. You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hope," he replied, his eyes unwavering. "You've shown me that it's never too late to change, to do better. And for that, I will always be grateful." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes, but this time, they were tears of joy. She leaned into him, resting her head against his chest as the garden's flowers swayed gently in the evening breeze. Their journey was far from over, but they had found a foundation of trust and partnership to build upon. Abigail had entered Henry's life as a reluctant bride, but she had become so much more, a partner, a confidant, and a force for change. And as they stood together under the starlit sky, she realized that she, too, had found something she thought she'd never have, a home.